And what I want to start with is just looking at some photos. So anytime that you go to a park or protected area, so a park or protected area could be Tuttle Creek, it could be Tallgrass National Prairie, which is a national park site in Kansas. It could be Cimarron National Grasslands, which is a Forest Service site in western Kansas. Those are all going to fall under the same purview, right? Or it could be Fort Larned, a historical site, which is run by the National Park Service. When I say protected areas, that's going to fall, that all of those will be in that category. So inherently, if visitors are going to go to these places, which we want them to do, there's going to be impacts. There's no way around that. The only way to prevent visitor impacts from occurring in a park or protected area is to not have visitors inside those areas. And again, we don't want that. So these are, I'm going to just kind of highlight some common impacts. So on a running trail, this is in a national battlefield site. This is, heavily rutted, but this was actually the site of a battlefield. So what are the implications for having a rutted running trail through the middle of a national battlefield? These over here are from ORV use, off-road vehicle use. Off-road vehicle use is not always the devil that people make it out to be, but limited use certainly can lead to lasting impact. It all depends on the condition or the amount of use. Some other use, these pictures inherently don't look like there's perhaps any problems here, but this picture here, there's actually a sign right here that says, please do not go over this wall. So they're obviously not listening to that. And then this right here, the kids are having a great time. This is at Gettysburg National Battlefield. However, there is a sign down here that says, please do not climb on the cannons. So even if we do our best efforts to provide information to visitors on how to protect the resources, oftentimes those messages are ignored. Or they're just not seen because what I like to say is people have vacation brain when they go to these places, right? They're not interested in reading, they're not interested in learning all the time. So they do things that they normally wouldn't do in everyday life. These are cairns. So cairns are trail markers that are used in areas that don't have a lot of trees to use for trailblazes. And this is what they're supposed to look like. This is a Bates Cairn. This is at Acadia National Park in Maine. And this is what they often look like after a busy day at the park. So unfortunately, either people don't know what these are as trail markers. This top rock here actually points the direction of the trail. And they topple them out of ignorance, or they do it because I don't know why, right? So that's just another visitor use impact. These two pictures, this picture here is probably familiar to many people. That is Old Faithful and Yellowstone. And here we have a bunch of people congregated around Old Faithful. This is actually a pretty light day at Old Faithful in this picture. It gets much busier than that. But there's issues of crowding. And that's perceived crowding and actual density number of people in a particular area. Both of those are factors in this discussion. And then we have things like this, right? You've probably all seen this with people putting their names on trees or carving their names into benches. Humans really like to see their name on things. So we're always going to have that. And we won't get into it today, obviously, but an interesting thing here is if you go to there's a place I think it's in Wyoming, it's called Inscription Rock. I think it was on the Oregon Trail. And we see somebody's name from 1875 or 1855 or whatever. That's historic. But at the time, it was probably graffiti, right? So where do we draw the line? Will this ever be historic? Polly loves Matt or whatever. And then we have wildlife. So wildlife, a lot of the reason that people go to parks and protected areas is to see wildlife. We want people to see wildlife. It's great, right? We want to build conservation ethic in people. And one way to do that is interacting with wildlife in natural settings. However, this is a large animal, right? And these folks are from here to the back of the wall in this room, so maybe 10 feet, 15 feet away from an animal that if it decides to, can make their day very bad. And then here, this is again in Yellowstone, this is a ranger, this is a black bear. And we have things called animal jams, right? So bear jams, elk jams, whatever you want to call it. where somebody sees an animal in a park or protected area and they stop in the middle of the road. It's a natural thing. I will admit that I've done it before myself, where I see something cool on the side of the road and I stop my car in the middle of the road and I get out of my car. I don't, you won't see me on YouTube videos fighting bison or anything like that, but it's a natural human behavior to want to see these things. So that's another thing that we have to think about. And then traffic. So how do people get to most of these places? They usually drive, right? There certainly are urban parks, there are community parks, but a lot of the bigger ones that people tend to want to visit, especially in the summer, they drive to. So we can go to a place like Grand Teton National Park here, and you can wait an hour just to get into the park. How does that impact your experience? Does your level of satisfaction go down? This is just a parking lot. It doesn't really matter where it is. This is in Pinnacles in California. But parking lots, how many times have you driven around a parking lot and not been able to find a place to park? Right? How frustrating is that? You just want to get out and hike, or you want to get out and see something, or you want to be out in nature and you're driving around in your car cursing because there's no place to park, right? So how do we deal with all those issues? And then I like these two pictures just because they're fun. Wildlife obviously is you can consider this guy wildlife if you want to, but visitor behavior has direct relationship on how animals behave as well too, right? So if this garbage can is not appropriate for an area that has animals that want to get into garbage cans, what are the animals going to do? They're going to get into the garbage cans, right? And raccoons are pretty good at getting into things. And this picture I particularly like because it's just an incredible juxtaposition of wilderness and crowding. So this is at Katmai National Park in Alaska, which is about 5 million acres plus or minus. And this is a line of people waiting to get to a platform to see bears in the middle of Alaska wilderness that you can only get to by boat or plane. What? That's crazy. So even in the most remote portions of our country, we're seeing lines to see, in this case, bears, right? So people really want to get out and see. And just as a number to throw out there, about 10 years ago, the visitation to national parks was 278 million people, about 10 years ago. Last year, it was 330 million. That's a pretty big jump. And that's only national parks. And visitation at state parks in general are increasing. Forests, national forests are increasing. So we're seeing a larger demand for people wanting to go to these places, which is great, right? We want that. Because a lot of the literature will tell us that the more contact that people have with these natural areas, the more likely they are to develop stewardship-related behaviors. So how do we deal with this? What do we do? So that's what we're going to talk about. So this is a list, but certainly not an exhaustive list of things that can be done to try to understand visitor use in parks and protected areas, and we're going to talk about some of these. A lot of the work that I do and a lot of the work that other people do is reliant upon surveys. Surveys have limitations, like every other research method, but it's certainly a way that we can try to understand how people feel about certain things in parks. We're going to talk quite a bit about cameras, counters, and GPS. These are certainly not new methods, but they are perhaps a little bit newer to the recreation resource management world. They've been around for quite a while, but we're starting to utilize them a bit more. And something we're going to talk a little bit too is social media. So obviously social media is very prevalent in everyday life. And a lot of people go to places because of social media. So if I didn't know about a place and then my friend posts something about this great place that they went and visited, they'd be like, oh, I didn't even know that existed. I probably want to go check that out too. So you can see how that might lead to increased visitation in certain places as well. So we're going to try to cover as much of these as we can here in the next half hour or so. Okay, so surveys. We're going to start with surveys. Survey methodology, again, has its limitations, but it does give us an insight into visitors' perceptions, attitudes, and at least reported behaviors. One of the primary limitations of survey research is that we are measuring reported behaviors, not actual behaviors. So somebody could say that they did something, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they did. That's why you want to have a large, robust, representative sample to try to control for some of those variables. These are just some of the locations. On-site visits, on-site survey administration is mostly the work that I do, because that way we know we're actually targeting the audience that we want to try to talk to. We're not necessarily sending out random samples. It's not a household survey. We want to know a specific question to a specific problem in a specific place. That's a lot of the work that I do. So a lot of the work that I do is based on normative theory. So normative theory, real simple, is we make the assumption that people coming to a park or protected have a common set of desires to go there, right? And there's certain normative pressures or normative ideals that people will conform to in these places based on their experience use history, okay? So what this is telling us, this basic graph here, is that we provide a set of conditions, and then they tell us how acceptable or unacceptable those conditions are. And I'll get into more specific examples here. And then we can quantitatively identify a range of acceptable conditions, right? So this middle line here, anything that falls below this middle line, visitors will rate as unacceptable conditions. Now here's the thing with this. One of the first things I said was, when visitors come to a park or protected area, we have to be able to have a tolerance for at least some level of visitor use impacts, right? Because if we had no tolerance for visitor use impacts, we wouldn't let anybody in, right? So there has to be a minimally acceptable condition that we're willing to tolerate and manage to, knowing that will also help to meet our desired conditions in that particular place. So to give you a more concrete example here, this is what it looks like at the end of the study, right? This is a standard, it's called a norm curve. And here, the couple things that you need to know about this graph here are, at the bottom, we have a series of photos that we show to people, and we show them to the people that are actually on site, so they have context. And this is 0 people all the way up to 35 people. We determine the number of people based on real conditions. This is in Aruba. So I went to Aruba. I stood at this place for probably 3 or 4 hours. I observed the conditions, and I tried to represent those conditions the best I could in these photographs. So then we give these pictures to people, and we ask them to rate them on this scale of -4 to +4. Say, okay, so how acceptable are these conditions? So what this graph here tells us is that for the most part, this yellow represents we're getting into the unacceptable range, and the red is unacceptable. So most people are like, we're not cool with having that many people in this area, right? But however, these photos here all represent a range of acceptable conditions. So now managers at this location can say, well, you know what, the threshold for this particular location is no more than 25 people at a time. And you can manage to that. That's a quantitative measure. You can set up cameras, you could have somebody go count once a month to see how the conditions are. And if you're exceeding that threshold that visitors have, that means that some sort of management action needs to be instituted, whether that's limiting use or dispersing use or whatever the case may be. So this gives managers a quantitative measure to work towards. These bubbles are basically the standard deviation, more or less. It's called the potential for conflict index, but it's based on variance and standard deviation. And the larger the bubble, the more variance there is in the answer. So essentially, this one, for example, there's a lot of agreement that this condition right here is pretty good, right? However, the level of agreement about this condition, although it's unacceptable, is not very good, right? So there's actually a pretty wide dispersal of answers to that. So we can actually say that it's pretty close to this line anyway, but the standard deviation, if I had to guess on that bubble, I don't know exactly, but it's probably on this scale, it's probably about 2. So that's a pretty wide range of answers on a scale of +4 to -4. But either way, this gives managers something that they can hang their hat on, and it's justifiable, and it provides scientific evidence of why you made a decision to limit use if that's what you want to do. We can also do a similar thing with trails. So trail conditions, and I should preface this by saying that almost all the literature points to visitors not having any idea about natural conditions, right? So if you gave somebody this series of pictures, which we did, they're not going to be real good at gauging those conditions. It's just not, it's not in most visitors' skill set. But you could say, here's the trail. What do you think about that? 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 And then they would rate that on that same scale, right? So, if you put it in the context of this, you're like, oh, that looks great. But some people might not have any problems with this, right? Like if my kids looked at that picture, they'd be like, oh, cool, puddle, right? But in terms of trail maintenance, that puddle is a big problem, right? Other things that we can do with these surveys, so that's looking at thresholds and indicators of quality. Other things you can do with the surveys is try to understand people's preference for certain things. So this one, for example, this is at Buffalo National River in Arkansas. They are thinking about, these are all possible management actions that the managers are considering, and we can get people to rank order those, and they can tell us which one of those they think is most preferable. And in terms, we can look at encounter rates, which is a little bit different than those graphs that we just looked at, but we can overlay, these are different locations within a park right here, and we can overlay people's encounter rates and their desirability for certain encounter rates on this graph to see if there's any commonalities or any trends that we might want to pull out in terms of management. I hesitate to even bring this up, but I will. Is a lot of the survey work, so typically when you do a survey, at least in the past, somebody would walk up to you, they'd give you a clipboard and a pencil, and they'd say, complete this survey, right? We're moving more towards using tablets instead of tablets such as iPads, instead of paper surveys. There's a couple reasons for that, but one of the primary reasons is people are familiar with the technology for the most part, and it eliminates human error when we put the data in after the fact. So if we had 1,000 paper surveys, somebody has to input that data, and that introduces human error into the process. So at least with this, that skips that step, so that's one more thing that we can kind of hang our hat on. However, I want to point this out that this is just one question. We compared a paper survey and a tablet survey, and this is on a 5-point scale, 5 being, so we need to take better care of plants and animals, 5 being strongly agree and 1 being strongly disagree. This is the mean for the paper survey. This is the mean for the tablet survey. And we had pretty good ends, right? So 172 and 129, so it wasn't just like 5 people. So what that tells us, or at least leads us to probably explore this a little bit further, is maybe there's a difference between tablets and paper surveys. So that certainly needs to be explored further. Okay, so that's all quantitative data that we can get from surveys. You can also do qualitative work. So qualitative is more in-depth. With quantitative, we want a lot of numbers. We want to try to have representative samples. With qualitative, we're looking at much smaller number of people that we talk to, and we're trying to get more rich data out of those individuals that we're talking to. You can think of focus groups as an example of something that you could use qualitative data, or a way that you can utilize qualitative data. So we'd ask people questions, and these are the kind of outputs that you would get, right? So you develop themes. So if we talk to 20 people and we asked them all the same question, we would go through their transcripts and we would see that there's themes within those 20 people that we talked to. We'd pull that out, and then we'd be able to get some general information about what people think. So that's qualitative data. Won't talk a lot about that. Okay, some more objective measures. So the surveys and the qualitative interviews are more subjective data, right? It's people's thoughts, their perceptions, their ideas. These human behavior cameras help us to capture more quantitative data, right? More objective data. So it's not reliant upon the visitor telling us what's going on. So what we can do is we can take these cameras, and these are all hidden in this area here, but there's 3 cameras here, and basically they're pointed at a visitor attraction, and we can see what visitors are doing. We can observe their behavior, but in most times we're trying to, we saw the norm curve earlier, so we can look at the pictures that we're taking with these cameras, compare it to the norm curve, and see if people are even perceiving the number of people correctly, right? So we can take the subjective and the objective data and compare the two to get a more robust sample and better understanding of what's happening at these places. So this is an example of a camera placement and what we're doing. This is at Buffalo National River. We put a camera here. Nobody can probably see it because it's not big enough, but it's right there. And we put that camera across the river because we were interested in seeing this. So this picture doesn't convey it necessarily, but this is a very popular put-in at this river. And the managers here were concerned that this place was overrun with visitors during the summer especially. So basically this camera takes a picture every 15 minutes and it gives us a general overview. We only check these cameras about once every 3 or 4 months. So if we put it at any more than 15 minutes, the camera would die within the first week or two, right? And these things take about 12 batteries each. So we can get this data, and then what we can do with that data is so this right here, this is our objective data, but we also had a survey that went along with this, and here's the survey results, okay, saying the range of acceptable conditions. These are the number of people, right, in their viewscape. And then what we can do is we can take the camera data and we can place what people said, which is about 23 people is our threshold, and we can place that on the camera data right here, and we can see that, you know what, we exceeded the threshold, but only a couple times, right? So maybe this place isn't nearly as overrun as the managers thought it was, right? I think humans have a tendency to see the worst set of conditions, and then that's their baseline, right? But what this does is this says, yeah, okay, you have a couple days where things get pretty crazy. And if we look at the dates, we can see that they don't really show us a whole lot of trends for this, but a lot of times they correspond to holidays, which makes sense. So this gives a ground truthing to the managers to say, okay, yes, it gets very busy, but it probably isn't as bad as you think it is. Certain places it actually is, but in a lot of cases it is not. We can also use GPS to track visitors. So when I say track visitors, I'm not saying we're collecting all of their personal information or anything like that. We use these little GPS trackers, which is in the hand here, and it's actually a data logger. It's not necessarily a tracker. So what it does is it pings a satellite every 10 seconds and collects the data for wherever that tracker is, but it doesn't collect real-time data. So if somebody collecting or using that GPS tracker gets lost in the woods, I can't find them. I know where they were once I found the tracker, but I wouldn't be able to find them in real time. It just collects data points from the satellites. But what those data points allow us to do is to see how visitors move in space and time. So this is at Fort Larned National Historic Site in Kansas. And basically all of these little spaghetti lines, these are all tracks. This is basically 100 tracks put on top of each other. And you can't see the direction of travel, but what we found out is, because we collect spatial and temporal data, is that we found out that people walked in right here, and then they walked over here, and then they walked here, and then many people quit here and went home, and not only half the number of people went here as they went here. So that's valuable information. It's like, okay, why aren't people going to the other side? Because there's some really cool stuff over there. But for whatever reason, people were not going over to the other side. So it allows us to do that. And also, it gives us time data, right? The time data is also important because then we can understand distribution of use over time. So this is at Cumberland Island National Seashore in Georgia. And basically what this is telling you is, you see the timestamps. This shows this use over time. So at 10 o'clock, this is where the darker the color, the more concentrated use. So as you can see, people move. This is a great example because almost every single person comes in here, goes to the beach, walks up the beach, and goes back here. The only way to get to this island is a ferry. They get off at the ferry here, they get on at the ferry here. So it's a good representation of use. But it shows you at what times people are moving about the island, right? So you can tell managers maybe where to place rangers, maybe where to have interpretive talks at certain times, right? So these heat maps are valuable for giving managers input into how to manage their parks. And then trail counters. Trail counters are valuable as another tool. Trail counters on their own aren't all that valuable because they need to be calibrated quite often, and they only give one data point. So we usually pair them with cameras and surveys to give us a fuller picture. But this is at the Bright Angel Trail in Grand Canyon. So we go out there and we find a place to hide one of our trail counters, which is right in here. And it's basically just an infrared beam that shoots across the trail. Every time somebody walks across the beam, it trips the counter, and then we get a count of what people are doing and when they went through that light. And then it generates data like this. So Grand Canyon shows us some decent spikes which correlate with some major events. So if you look at this monthly total down here, so every time somebody walks by, it generates a point and then it creates these graphs. In May, you can see we have a big spike, and this is at a 1 counter. There's like 8 or 9 counters that we have out. But there's a spike in May, and there's a spike in October. In May, there's the north rim and the south rim of the Grand Canyon. The north rim of the Grand Canyon opens in May, and it closes in October. So that's when there's a rush of people to do those activities. They want to get out as soon as possible, and then they want to get out before it closes. But that allows us to identify those trends, and only crazy people go to the Grand Canyon in July. So at least hiking. But it gives you all of these numbers, and they need to be calibrated. If you just put a trail counter out tomorrow, and then you got a bunch of data back, you won't be able to tell what it means, right? You have to calibrate it. You have to know how many people, you have to sit there and count how many people go through and make sure that the counter is actually counting those people. And here, we have the added elements of mule traffic. So how do you account for 4 legs going through at a time, right? So we have to calibrate those counters on a regular basis. And then we can do trail surveys, right? So this is a very quantitative method where we have a trail here and we measure for all of these different things. And again, a lot of these things are related to monitoring over time. If we collect one of these data points and then we never do anything with it again, it's worthless, right? So if we collect this trail here, which is a pretty well-worn trail, it's not too wide, but it does have a decent level of incision, which is depth. But basically, we can set up a transect, and we can understand the depth, the rugosity, which is basically the rockiness. We can look at the visual and see if the trail is braiding, if it's moving, the muddiness. And then if we go back in a couple months or a year or whatever the protocol may be, we can see if there's been any change to that trail and if we need to enact certain management actions that may help preserve that trail over time. So this is a very time-intensive procedure. So if this trail is a mile long, depending on how many, like if it's a mile long, we'd probably do every 1/10 of a mile, we'd do a measurement. If the trail is 20 miles long, we'd probably do maybe every mile. Or if certain sections are more intensely used, we might focus on those intensely used areas. And I think this is the last method I'm going to talk about. This is a climbing site. This is in the Red River Gorge in the Daniel Boone National Forest in Kentucky. This is the base. This is somebody standing on a rock here, and this is the base of a climb. So climbers will set up down here, and as you can see, there's a pretty clear demarcation of the impact area, right? So anytime you have people setting up a climb or you have a campsite or whatever, you're going to have an impacted area. So what this method does is it basically looks at the visual boundaries of that area, and then you set up a transect to see the length and the width and the volume essentially of that impacted area, and then you can compare that over time, and that's what this study looked at. It looked at 2007 and 2013. And one of the take-homes from this study was the way impacts work is it's a curvilinear relationship. So if you have a pristine campsite, essentially you're going to see the vast majority of your impacts in the first couple uses, right? So your line's going to go up really quick. If impacts are here, right, you're going to see your impacts go up very quickly. However, over time, that line evens out. Because as you can see here, you can't really get any more impacted than this. There's root exposure, it's dirt. You're not going to have any more impacts, pretty much, unless somebody goes in there with a backhoe. So those initial impacts are really important to monitor because once it's impacted, that's the way it's going to be for quite a while unless you go in there and actually do something managerial, either closing it or rehabbing it, whatever the case may be. Okay, then social media. So I'll talk real quick about this. Social media is a way to find out where people are going, right? So we can harvest, one of my graduate students is working on harvesting Twitter data at Katmai National Park in Alaska. So what she's basically trying to find out is, can we use social media data, in this instance, Twitter data, to understand visitor use patterns, right? Because what do people do when they go places? They take pictures, sometimes they're geotagged, and then they upload them to social media. So if we can understand how people are moving, what they're taking pictures of, where they're going, where concentrated use is, perhaps social media is a way to do that, and we can do that from here. We don't ever have to go to Alaska to do that, right? Going to Alaska to collect surveys, very expensive, right? Collecting Twitter data, it's free. I don't know if it's going to work yet. She's working on her research right now, but that's kind of what we're thinking. And you can also purchase phone data too. So we all have phones and we all have GPS on our phones, most of us. I do know somebody with a flip phone still, but most of us have GPS on our phones. And you can opt out of it, but most of us don't, right? So it's constantly tracking you and where you're going. So you can purchase that data from one of these companies and then you can understand visitor use patterns that way, because everybody's going to have their phone on them. So that's something we're going to actually start doing at Joshua Tree in California coming this spring. We're going to start testing that to see what we can figure out. And then I do believe this is the last one, is anybody ever been to explore.org before? Anybody ever heard of it? Okay. You should make a note of it because it will waste your entire day looking at bears or cheetahs or dolphins or whatever the case may be. Basically, they have webcams all over the world. So this webcam right here is at Katmai National Park, and it's focused on the bears. So you can go there and get a live feed. Right now, if we went to that website, there'd be a camera, and we'd see some bears hanging out. So what we did is we did a study basically asking people to complete a survey of their viewing experience online. And we compared it to visitors that actually went to the park to see if there's any difference in their pro-conservation related behaviors, reported behaviors. What we found, and this is a preliminary study, and I'm happy to talk about this later, but what we found is that there really isn't much of a difference. So the implication here is, if we're really trying to protect that bear in that environment, it's perhaps better that we don't send a lot of people up there and disturb that bear in that environment. And if we can generate pro-environmental behaviors from viewing a webcam, is that something we should be looking into, right? These people developed very intense relationship with these bears online. There's chat rooms, there's ranger chats. They name the bears, they know where the bears are. Bear 33321, otherwise known as Otis, is eating right now. If you go to camera 3, you can check them out, right? I gave a presentation in one of the chat rooms last year. I mean, it's a community. And community is one of the things that we look at when we talk about conservation and pro-conservation behaviors, building a community. So this could be it's an interesting line of work at the very least.